Hey everyone, I'm Sue Daley and I'm really excited because today we're going to start the sew along for the Infusion quilt, which is a remake of my raspberry tea quilt from my Raspberry Parlour book, and we've called it Infusion because it's all scrappy, so it's going to look something like this. Yours might look like this, or you may just use the fabrics from your stash and create whatever it is you want to create. The only thing I've done is tied it together with a common sashing and a common cornerstone. Before we get started, I just want to make a note to you guys that page 19, there is a correction in the book, and you will find a little card like this which will tell you what that correction is. So just make sure you have that. If you don't, you'll find that on our website. So first of all, the center block is made up of one block, and we're going to cut it 19 inches square, and then we're going to trim it back to 18.5 after we've done the applique. So if you have your fabric and you cut it 19 inches square, then we're going to fold it in half and into quarters, and then I press it to get my quarter lines, my quarter marks, so that I can use those for my placement lines when I'm placing out all my applique pieces. So if you have your piece of fabric and you fold it into half and then into quarters, give it a press just to get those marks, where you can use those as your reference points when you're placing your applique pieces down. So you will see all of the step-by-step instructions on my blog. This is basically, for me today, the video is just about an overview on this particular block, so you can see it in person, but reference back to my blog and you'll be able to see all the step-by-step instructions for it. So we have our center block, and then we have to prepare all of our applique pieces that go on that block. So we need to prepare these pieces here. So we've got a center piece, and we've got some leaves here and some circles, some flowers, and then this little bit of English piecing here on the corners. But I'll start with this first. And we've also got some bias strip here, and I'll show you how to use the bias maker, because a lot of people are not sure how to use that. I know for me, years and years ago, I had one for the longest time, and I didn't use it because I didn't know how. Once I was taught, I never looked back. I just love it because it makes your bias strips so nice and neat. So first of all, we're going to work with making some templates for this. So I generally will use a template paper. So sometimes you might have something like template plastic. This is like a heavy duty tracing paper, which I prefer. It's much easier on your scissors. It's much more accurate. You can run it through your photocopier, and you can keep it. It'll last forever. Just don't spill your coffee on it, otherwise you're in trouble. So template paper is what I like to use. And so you make your templates out of that, and I'm going to come back and show you how I'm going to trace around those, and we'll get started on the block. So what we need to do first is to take some template paper, and we're going to trace around the pattern pieces in the book, and we're going to create all of our templates, which will look like this. So with the template paper, it's easy to write on as well, so you won't have any trouble writing on with a pen or pencil, so you can mark what it is, and maybe if you need to cut, how many you need to cut. I don't put a lot of detail on mine. So cut them all out, so you just need one of each, so one for the center in here, one for the flower here, and then one for the leaves and one circle here. So I have all of those here. So once you've got all of those, we're ready to start preparing our fabric for our applique. So I will then take a sandpaper board. So I like to work on a sandpaper board because if you are going to draw on a piece of fabric and you draw just on a normal surface, your fabric's going to move. If you place it onto a sandpaper board, then the fabric's not going to move. So you're going to have a better chance of drawing around your outside shape. So this piece is for the center, for the big piece. So you're just going to place it on top of your fabric, so on the right side. Now, some of you will do your applique a little bit differently to me, and that's okay. You can do it the way that you like to do it, but this is the way I do it. So I do traditional needle turn applique. So I'm drawing the shape of my template is going to be drawn onto the right side of my fabric. So I'm using a trio pencil, which is a sew line product. You can turn it around to whatever colour you need, and I'm just going to draw around the outside of my shape. And because I'm using a white pencil, you're probably not going to see this terribly well on the video, but I will show you another one that I've prepared. Just make sure that your lead is out far enough so that you're able to draw around it. So you're just drawing around the outside shape edge of it and making sure you have about 1/4 inch around the outside of this, because you're going to cut your seam allowance onto this shape. So you're going to add your seam allowance, which is going to be around about, you know, a scant 1/4 inch is about 3/16 of an inch wide. You don't want it too wide because it's much easier to applique with a smaller seam allowance than a wider seam allowance. So once you've done that, you've put your design onto your fabric, you're going to cut it with about a 3/16 seam allowance. So I've got one here that I've done with a darker pen so you can see it. So you can see here, probably not terribly well, but there is about a 3/16 seam allowance. So you're going to cut that out like that. Now what you're then going to do is we're going to cut into our curves here. So the inverted curves here, you're going to clip into those curves to within about 2 threads of the drawn line. So don't cut right to the drawn line. So you're going to cut on these inside curves, but don't ever cut on the outside curves. So don't ever clip into these curves, but clip into these curves. If you clip onto these outside curves, you're going to get a point on your curve as you're sewing it down, and you don't want that. So only clip on the inside curves. Okay, so once you've prepared that, go ahead and prepare all of your other applique shapes, and then we'll lay them all down and glue them down so that your whole block's ready to sew and you don't then have to get up again. You can just see it and sew in peace and enjoy watching the TV or whatever you do when you're sewing. Okay, so I'll be back in just a moment and I will show you how I'm going to place these out onto my fabric. So just before we lay it out, I'm going to show you how to use the bias maker to make your little bias strips for your stems here. So it's really simple. This is what I've prepared, and you can see how nice and neat that is. It's really, really flat, and it's just the same size all the way from the top to the bottom. So I cut my pieces of fabric. Now because these stems are straight, you can cut them on the straight of the grain. But if you were doing a bias edge where it had a curve in it, you would cut it on a 45-degree angle. So you would cut your strips across your fabric, across the grain on 45-degree. These are straight, so I can cut these on the straight of the grain. So I cut them, I'm making 1/4 inch bias. So I use a 1/4 inch bias maker, and I only cut my pieces of fabric at 1/2 inch. So 1/2 inch wide, and then a little bit longer than what you need it to be. Okay, so I'm going to take my bias maker and I'm going to so I always make sure I've got an angle on my fabric here. So I'm going to place that pointed part into my bias maker with the wrong side facing up and just push it through, and that is about the time I get a pin and I can start just moving it through from the back so that it comes out this end here. Alright, make sure it's sitting flat into your bias maker. Now I then will put it onto my ironing surface, make sure that's flat. I pull it out a little bit and I put a pin in the very end of it just to hold it in place. So I actually pin it to my ironing surface just to hold it there. I make sure that my strip sits nicely into my bias maker, and then I get my iron and I just move it along, and I keep the tip of my iron right up close to the tip of my bias maker, and I move my iron along. And there you have it. So it's the same size from the top to the bottom, easy. So you're going to go ahead and make 4 of those for our stems. Okay, so now I'm going to come back and I'll show you how to lay it all out. Okay, now for the placement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place all my pieces out. I'm not going to glue them down to start with. I'm going to put them all out onto my, my background fabric and make sure they're all in the right place, and then I can go ahead and glue them down, because I want to make sure that I get everything laid under what it needs to go under, and the things that need to go over on top of the things that they need to go over. So I'll place my my first piece, the big piece, down just for placement. So I've got the center of that big piece lining up with the center of the fold that I've got on my background, and the center going through there. So make sure you refer back to your book, so you make sure you put this the right way around. And then I'm going to get my bias pieces, and I'm going to just lay them on there just for an idea. Now these are way too long, but I just want to get an idea of where this is going to work. So I can probably cut these in half actually. But you're just getting an idea of where all this is going to be placed. You want to make sure your bias is going to come in underneath. So you want to poke that one in under there, and it's going to sit up here. Okay, and you might want to just move this off your... So I usually work on my ironing surface at this point, because once I get this placed, I'm going to glue it and iron it so it sticks immediately, and then it's all going to stay in place when you pick it up and walk away with it, because you don't want to pick it up and it all falls on the ground. Some of you might prefer to pin. I prefer to glue based, simply because the pins get in my way. I crunch my work when I sew, so I don't want the pin sticking in my hands, and I know that the glue will keep it stuck there while I'm sewing. And if I've glued in the wrong place, I can just pull it back up. So I'm just going to lay that down there just for placement, and then I'm going to take my little flower piece. So I have 4 of those, and it will sit roughly about there. You can follow your placement diagram in your book. So it's going to sit about there. So all of these will sit in under, so all of your little bias strips are going to go in under like that, and your fabrics can be placed around like this. So once I work out where it is I actually want this piece, I'm going to clip my bias strip, and then I'm going to place this on top, and then I can glue that down. Okay, so I'm going to take my scissors, so roughly about here is where I'm going to clip, so I'm just going to cut that off with my scissors, and then I can get that basted in place. Now normally when I'm working with a bias strip, if it's something that's working and it's with a bias strip that's curved, I don't generally glue it down, because when you're using a curve you need to be strict, because it stretches a lot, you need to be moving along as it stretches. But because this is cut on the straight of the grain, I can just put a few spots of glue under that to hold it. So I'm just going to put a couple of spots of applique glue on there just to hold it in place. Now make sure that goes in under and sits on that fold line that we did earlier. So make sure that's right in under your seam allowance there. It sits on top there, and then we can take the iron and give that a press, and it will stay in place. Once the iron, the heat hits that, it will make sure it adheres to the background. And then we can take our little flower block. We can put a tiny bit of applique glue on here. I have a lot of videos on YouTube that talks about applique, my technique of applique, so you can go back and refer to those, and I have done another one within this series, this sew along as well. So this is going to sit about here. You've got to make sure it sits in from the seam allowance a little bit. Remember, this block will be trimmed back a little bit once you're finished, so make sure it's not sitting right up to the edge. Put the iron on it, it will stick straight away. And then of course we can go in and fold this back and just glue this little top piece down on here. Sometimes people like to use a light board and a light box, and they put their design underneath and then stick it on top. I find that with applique it doesn't really matter, like the placement, you can generally get it pretty good just by eyeballing it. So what you're going to do is work around that whole design and place everything down, making sure that the bias strips go in under it. In your book it tells you which ones are the first ones that go down. So your your bias strips are numbered number 1, because that has to go in under both of those, and number 2 is going to be this one in the middle, and then of course number 3 are your flowers, and then of course your little leaves that are coming out here. But basically The only one that matters the most here is this number 1 has to go in underneath those. So then you'll take your little leaf shapes. Now make sure when you're cutting these, you need to cut half of them going one way and half of them going the other way. Okay, so they're going to sit in here like this. Okay, just remember that when you put your seam allowance under, you're going to have a bigger gap between your pieces, so you can always move these down a little bit closer. Okay, and you can move them in a little bit if you want, so that it's closer to the stem. And then you're going to just glue those down as well. So take your applique glue again, just do one at a time, just tiny wee bits of glue. You don't need very much at all. People tend to use a little bit too much applique glue, but it does wash out if you happen to use too much. You're just going to place them down like so, making sure that they look even from both sides. I'll just do the last two for you. And the last one. Just don't put your glue too close to the edge, because remember you've got that seam allowance that you need to tuck under. Okay. Alrighty, just give it a bit of a press so that it sticks it to the background. Because when you're moving it around, you don't want it to all, you know, if you don't iron it, it'll move a little bit, because it takes a little while to glue, and I don't have time to stand around waiting for glue to dry. It's like watching grass grow, right? Okay, so you're going to go ahead and prepare all of that. And then once you get that down, what we're going to do is we're going to come back and I'm going to add the corners. So these corners here. So this is a little bit of English piecing. So we'll come back and then we'll piece those up, and then you'll add those to the corners. And then that block will be done. Okay, so I will prepare the next step and I'll be back shortly. So I've placed almost all of it out onto my center block. So I've got most of it laid on and glued on. I just have to put the leaves on. But what I want to work with you now is these corner pieces for the English piecing. So in your in the template and paper pack, you will get a template, a little rounded thimble template like this, and that's what you're going to use to cut your fabric for your thimble shapes, which will look like this. So you need 4 for each corner, so that would be 16 of these pieces. So they all can be cut. You can cut them in layers, so layers of 4 or 6, or however sharp your rotary cutter is what determines how many layers you can cut at once. So I've cut 16, so I've pieced these up. I'm just going to quickly show you how to glue these and to glue that curved edge. So let's take one of these papers. Remember, the paper is silk coated on both sides, so it doesn't matter which side you use it or which side you glue on. I'm going to place my paper onto my fabric. Now, this is just how I do it. I generally will fold my curved edge over last on this, because when I'm appliquing it down, if I need to manipulate the fabric at all, at least that's not caught in anywhere. So I start on this side and work around in an anti-clockwise direction. So I'm just going to run the glue pen on the paper inside the edge so as to not run it down onto the fabric. Turn it over. And it'd be easier if I wasn't working on a fabric surface, however, we'll make do. Turn it over. So running your glue pen onto your paper, away from the edge so it doesn't get all caught up in that edge. Fold your fabric over, and then when you do this curved edge, run your glue pen all the way around, just a little bit on your fabric as you folded it over there, and then keep it down low and then drag your edges over. Don't pick it up in your hands and try and do it. If you drag it in and be a little bit assertive around that curved edge, it will pull all the little points and puckers down low. So when you've done it, you have a nice smooth edge across the top that you can applique with. Okay, so that's the gluing. So it doesn't really matter, but that's just the way I like to do it. I'm going to sew those together. So all that is you're just sewing these seams together along here. So you're going to create 4 that look like this. So I'm just going to take a needle and a thread, and I'm going to just piece that. So I'll use, try and find the end of my thread would be handy. Okay, there it is. Take my scissors. Now a lot of my techniques you'll find on my other YouTube videos, so if there's something that you really need to see up close, you can jump onto my YouTube channel and see those videos. Okay, I'm going to just pop a knot in the end of my thread. So that's a quilter's knot, so I do the wraps around the needle. Then we're going to put these two pieces together, and I generally sew. I sew from right to left, but if you're left-handed you'll probably sew left to right. Lose your thread up in behind, in between your card and your seam allowance. Come in for one stitch, and as I said, you'll see this up close on some of my other YouTube videos. But we're going to do the knicker knot, so we're just going to come in, leave your needle in your work, you take one stitch, wrap it under to the left, take your thread, wrap it under to the right, till you get your little figure 8 knot that you're locking off. And we're just going to stitch along the side of this until we get to the other end. So continue all the way up to the other end, do a knicker knot, and then we're just going to add the other one. So you'll end up with 4 of these. Okay, so what I then do, there's a couple of ways you can do these corners. So one of them is, in the book it tells you to lay them into the corners, and it clearly, because we've got to trim this block back, you can sit these blocks in a little bit to allow for your 1/4 inch trimming back on each side. So what I've done is I've pulled the seam allowance out from my paper so that I get a more accurate placement. So what you want to do is make sure that it's the same distance here and here. You don't want it to look like this. You need it to be the same distance from here to here. The other thing that you could do, which might make it a little bit easier for you, is you could trim the block back now. Once you've sewn it, once you've sewn all of this on, you could then trim your block back to your 18.5 and then put these on, and they will sit flush with the edge. But if you don't trim it first, you have to sit those pieces in with your seam allowance pulled out a roughly 1/4 inch in from the edge. Okay, you will remove your papers first, so press them, remove the papers out, put your glue on the back, and then iron it onto your fabric, and then you're going to sew around this edge and this edge with an applique stitch. So you're going to continue and do that on the 4 corners, and that will be your center block finished. So that is the major part of the quilt. Everything else is little, which is fun because you're doing all sorts of different things all the time. Even though you're repeating some of the blocks over and over, by using different fabrics, it's a fun quilt to make. So you can practice with different things. You can fussy cut, you can use some little novelty prints in some of the centers of these. Do whatever you want to do. Make it your own quilt. Just because I designed the quilt doesn't mean that you can't make it your own. I love to see what you do. So make sure you're sending us some feedback on what you're doing. Send some photos in so we can repost them on social, and we look forward to seeing you next time.